Where is their equivalent evidence basis to Treasury modelling published by the government on the industry and employment impacts of climate change? Where is their equivalent evidence basis to Treasury modelling published by the government on the cost impacts of households from the carbon pollution reduction scheme and on the adequacy of the compensation arrangements put in place by the Commonwealth Government in the government's white paper? The answer to both these questions is there is no evidence. None has been provided, none from any official source. Where is the evidence basis offered by the new League of World Government Conspiracy Theorists that climate change can be effectively dealt with by market means or by uncoordinated national means? Again, no body of evidence, no official evidentiary document has been produced anywhere to substantiate that position. The truth is that the do-nothing climate change sceptics offer no alternative official body of evidence from any credible government anywhere in the world. Absolutely none. The truth is they offer zero credible evidence. Instead, they offer maximum fear, universal conservative stock in trade. And by doing so, these do-nothing climate change sceptics are prepared to destroy our children's future. The third group of climate change deniers are those who pretend to accept the science but then urge delay because they don't want their country to be the first to act. In Australia, there was once a political consensus resisting this parochial view. The Shergold report, commissioned by John Howard and written by the head of Mr Howard's department, Shergold himself, recommended that Australia should not wait for the rest of the world to act. This is what Mr Howard's report said on this prior to the last election, and I quote it: "Waiting until a truly global response emerges before imposing an emissions cap will place costs on Australia by increasing business uncertainty and delaying or losing investment." Unquote. Thus spake the Howard government. The current Leader of the Opposition also stated that a domestic emissions trading scheme would help in international negotiations too. And I quote, "Our first-hand experience in implementing an emissions trading scheme would be of considerable assistance in our international discussions and negotiation aimed at achieving an effective global agreement," unquote, in July last year. And again, the Leader of the Opposition stated he no longer supported domestic action before Copenhagen, when in March this year he said, I would not support finalising the design this year. Even the best designed scheme in theory needs to have the input of the knowledge of what happens at Copenhagen and what the Americans will do," unquote. Remember, we've already lost 12 years on this. What has happened over the 2 years since we have been in office? 7 times since then, the Liberals and Nationals have promised to make a decision on their policy on climate change, and 7 times they have delayed. In December 2007, they said they would wait for Garnaut. In September 2008, they said they would wait for the Treasury modelling. In September 2008, they said they would wait for the white paper. In December 2008, they'd said they'd wait for their own commissioned report entitled the Pearce Report. All of these things have been delivered. In April 2009, they said they'd wait for the Senate inquiry. In May 2009, they said they'd wait for the Productivity Commission, forgetting, unfortunately, that the Productivity Commission had already made a submission on emissions trading to the Howard Government Shergold report. And now the Liberals and Nationals have said they wait for Copenhagen and for President Obama's scheme. It is an endless cycle of delay, and I'm sure that with December almost upon us, the 8th excuse cannot be far away, which will be to wait until next year or the year after, until all the rest of the world has acted, at which time Australia will act. What absolute political cowardice, what absolute failure of leadership, what absolute failure of logic. The inescapable logic of this approach is that if every nation makes the decision not to act until others have done so, then no nation will ever act. The immediate and inevitable consequence of this logic, if echoed in other countries, is that there will be no global deal and that there would never be a global deal. As each nation says to its domestic constituencies that they cannot act because others have not yet acted. The result is a negotiating stalemate, a permanent standoff, a self-fulfilling climate sceptics strategy. And this, of course, is the consistent ambition of all three groups of the do-nothing climate change deniers that I've referred to in my remarks today. As we approach Copenhagen, it becomes clearer that the domestic political pressure produced by the climate change sceptics now has profound global consequences by reducing the momentum towards an ambitious global deal. The argument that we must not act until others do is an argument that has been used by political cowards since time immemorial, both of the left and of the right. To take just one example, it has been used as an argument to retain protectionism, stifling economic growth and global competition and preventing the spread of global prosperity. As many have noted, it is the international political version of the prisoner's dilemma. If we allow our actions to be dictated by what we falsely conclude to be in our own narrow self-interest, then we harm not just others, but we also harm ourselves, because climate change inaction harms us as well. Climate change deniers may be small in number, but they are too dangerous to be ignored. Hence my remarks today. They are well resourced. They are well represented by political conservatives in many countries. And the danger they pose is this: by collapsing political momentum towards national and global action on climate change, they collapse global political will to act at all. They are the stick that gets stuck in the wheel that, despite its size, may yet bring the train to a complete stop. And that is what they want, because they are driven by a narrowly defined self-interest of the present and utterly contemptuous towards our children's interest in the future. This brigade of do-nothing climate change sceptics are dangerous because if they succeed, then it is all of us who will pay, all of us who will suffer, our kids and our grandkids. If we fail, then it will be a failure that will echo through future generations. The consequences for Australia of failing to act domestically and internationally on climate change are severe. We know from formal, global and national economic modelling that the costs of inaction are greater than the costs of acting. Treasury modelling from October 2008 shows that economies that defer action on climate change face long-term costs around 15% higher than those that take action now. The sooner we act, the better placed our companies will be to benefit from new emerging global markets and to benefit from the economic gains from improved efficiency. Moving to a low-pollution economy will require significant investment in renewable energy, carbon capture and storage, energy efficiency and low emissions technologies. We need to start giving the signals to investors that they need to factor the price of carbon into their decisions to make the investments we need. Importantly, business needs certainty, absolute certainty for the rules for the future. Such investments are, by definition, long-term and require long-term certainty. To conclude, these are the implications for Australia. These are the political challenges we now face both at home and abroad. But my unequivocal message to the nation today is that this nation, Australia, will not be deterred. Our course is clear. That is why the government will press forward with our plan to tackle climate change domestically and globally. Domestically, we'll press ahead to the passage of the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme. It will be voted on in the House in the week beginning Monday, November 16. It will be introduced into the Senate immediately after the vote in the House. It will be then voted on in the Senate in the week beginning 23 November. We welcome the opposition's recent cooperation, and I'm pleased to hear from Minister Wong that negotiations are proceeding in good faith. I'd like to personally commend the member for Groom for his genuine efforts to engage with the government in good faith to reach a reasonable outcome with the government that will finally deliver action domestically on climate change. At the same time, we are deeply concerned by comments by the Leader of the Opposition in the Senate, Senator Minchin, when he said only a few days ago, and I quote him, "Even if the government accepts all of our amendments, we may well still vote against the bill," unquote. The do-nothing climate change sceptics are still alive and well in the coalition. After 12 years of inaction and after 2 years of preparation, the nation demands a genuine timetable for good faith negotiations to give business the certainty that they need for climate change. The Australian government is also committed to intensively engaging to support an ambitious agreement in Copenhagen. At Copenhagen, we need an ambitious agreement on mitigation, on adaptation, on finance and on technology. As UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said yesterday, the formal UN negotiations are moving slowly. The UN Secretary-General has said we must maximise the agreement we can reach in Copenhagen. They can resolve some issues, but not others. Now is the time for strenuous efforts by all leaders and by all ministers. Denmark's Prime Minister Rasmussen is engaging a growing number of leaders in the Copenhagen Commitment Circle to accelerate engagement by leaders direct. Australia is committed to playing a leadership role and has joined Mexico and the UN Secretary-General in this initial group of Friends of the Chair to build consensus and to draw out concrete commitments from across the world. In July this year, we began this process at the meeting of the Major Economies Forum in L'Aquila in Italy, which helped form a 2 degrees Celsius 450 parts per million ambition, agreed ambition, for global action on climate change. This was reflected in the communique of the Pacific Island Leaders Forum in September. In September also, Australia, at the request of the UN Secretary-General, co-chaired a roundtable at the UN Special Session on Climate Change. Australia has also launched foreign carbon partnerships with Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and we've established an adaptation fund to support the real impact of climate change with a strong focus on countries in the Pacific. For years then, with increasing intensity, in recent months, do-nothing climate change sceptics have been mounting a systematic campaign against action on climate change. Their aim is not to convince every person on earth of the follies of acting on climate change. Their aim is to erode just enough of the political will that action becomes impossible. By slowing the actions of each individual country, they aim to slowly drag global negotiations on climate change to a standstill. By hampering decisive action at a national level, they aim to make it impossible at an international level. If Copenhagen does not deliver the outcome we so urgently need, no individual climate change sceptic will be responsible, that each of them will have played a part. The corrosive effect of climate sceptics eroding the political will to act may be the disintegration of any possibility of meaningful action on climate change. In this debate, the climate change sceptics have erected an intellectual house of cards based on one single premise, that the cost of not acting is nothing. When you boil down their arguments, their world government conspiracy theories, their back-of-the-envelope calculations, that, in its starkest simplicity and entirety, is what is left, that the cost of not acting is nothing. That is the simplest premise upon which the scepticism of Malcolm, of Barnaby, of Andrew and of Janet and even Lord Monckton is based. They cling to that single premise like a polar bear clings to the melting iceberg. Without that premise, their scepticism is sunk. Malcolm, Barnaby, Andrew, Janet and the Thatcherite Lord Monckton are betting the house on that simple premise that the cost of not acting is nothing. For people who claim to hold the Conservative torch, their scepticism is in fact radical in its riskiness and its recklessness. By deliberately undermining and eroding the capacity to achieve both domestic and international action on climate change, the sceptics are attempting to force the world to take the single most reckless bet in the history of our world. They are betting our future, the future of our children, the future of our grandchildren. And they are doing so based on their own personal intuitions, their personal prejudices, and their deeply ingrained political prejudices. And they are doing so in a total absence of any genuine body of evidence. Climate change sceptics, in all their guises and disguises, are not conservatives. They are, in fact, the radicals. They are reckless gamblers who are betting all of our futures on their arrogant assumption that their intuitions should triumph over all evidence. The logic of these sceptics belongs in the casino, not in the science laboratory, and not in the ranks of any responsible government. Malcolm, Barnaby, Andrew, Janet, even Lord Monckton shouldn't even bother with the pretence of science and just admit the currency of their prescription for inaction has all the legitimacy of a roulette wheel. Basically, let's just sit back, do nothing, and see what happens. The alternative, our alternative, is to base policy on the evidence. No responsible government, confronted with the evidence delivered by the 4,000 scientists associated with the International Panel of Climate Change Scientists, could then in conscience choose not to act. In any public company, it would represent a gross contempt for the most basic fiduciary duty. Malcolm and Barnaby might like to bet the future of Australia on the off chance of winning an election, but this government will not. A fairly well-known bloke once said of gambling, you've got to know when to hold them, you've got to know when to fold them, you've got to know when to walk away, and you've got to know when to run. My message to the climate change sceptics, to the big betters, and the big risk takers is this: you're betting on our children's future and the future of our grandchildren, the future of our economy, the future of our country, the future of our world. You're betting on our jobs, you're betting on our houses, our farms, our reefs, our economy and our future. And you're betting it and basing it on an intuition, a gut feeling, a political prejudice that you have about the science. That is too big a risk, too radical a departure from the basic conservative principles of public policy. So I say to Malcolm, to Barnaby, to Andrew, to Janet and all the rest, stop gambling with Australia's future. You've got to know when to fold them, and that time has come. The government that I lead will act. I thank you.
Prime Minister, thank you. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, so can we start with the lady in the middle? Please wait for the microphone.
Fiona Wake, Environment Business Australia. Prime Minister, thank you. I would say that they are also gambling and betting on collateral damage and short-termism being the way forward. Representing the environment industry, the low-carbon environmental goods and services sector, which is a $6 trillion industry worldwide, we really need the support that you've just voiced, because we do see a way forward. We see great opportunity in action. We see commercial opportunity in action for technology companies, infrastructure companies, banks and finance houses. So, okay, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for that. Often people undertake an analysis of the transitional impact of climate change on the economy and existing firms in an entirely static way. That is, they do not factor in what actually occurs in the rest of the economy. They don't factor in what happens with the rapid development of our renewable energy sector, clean energy industries, and all the associated financial instruments and innovations associated with that. The figure that I quoted before, which comes from official sources, predicting a 30-fold increase in the clean energy sector in the country on the basis of changes of the type that I've outlined, obviously has huge employment consequences as well. Remember, when each other transformational time has occurred in the economic history of our world, there have always been dislocations, but if they are properly transitioned, as we are seeking to do through the transitional arrangements we put in place through the legislation which is before the Senate, both for industry and for households and for regions, etc., then you can get through transitionally in good shape, but you also open up the future for fundamental transformations in the economy and birthing a whole range of new sectors and types of economic activity. Opening up a new growth model for the future as well. One of the new range of new growth drivers the global economy needs, particularly given what's happened in the economic and financial implosions in the United States in recent times, which triggered so much of the global financial crisis. That is coming off the back purely of debt-driven consumption. So, in terms of global macroeconomic possibilities, as well as the transitional arrangements we put in place together with the enormous potential of the renewable energy sector in Australia, I believe we should be embracing these changes with gusto, and mainstream business is saying to us that. Give us the rules so we can get on with it and generate the new jobs and new industries of the future.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Archie Law from Action Aid. My question just, I suppose, broadens the debate to the international dimension, and UNDP's estimate that an additional $200 billion would be required per year to deal with adaptation for poor countries. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts about how is Australia going to pick up our fair share of that approximately $200 billion, but also whether that should be compensatory in nature, given that those countries didn't actually cause the problem, it's the countries that over the decade that caused the problem.
Let me answer your question in two ways. I'll take the last bit first and then go back to your original question. And that is, as I've sat around the table with various leaders in the last year or so talking about this, if you were to try and summarise how it often boils down, it's a debate between the past and the future, a debate between past responsibility and future responsibility. The accumulated stock of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere right now, which have been building up since the Industrial Revolution, are almost exclusively as a product of the combined polluting activities of, let's call it, the Western world. However, roll the clock forward until mid-century and then project, based on current growth models and energy intensity models, you'll find that the bulk of the stock that will be generated additionally over the next half a century will in fact come from major economies like China and India. And so rather than have this constant rolling brawl between the past and the future, we need what I've described in our meetings around the world as a grand bargain between the past and the future. It becomes a grand bargain between developed and developing economies. That should be the conceptual framework with which we approach it. It's evidence-based. You can simply calculate the parts per million, which are there. Those are going to be produced, and you work out who's done it. And frankly, all either have sinned or will sin and will have fallen short of the glory of God, to paraphrase something from somewhere. So then you go to the next question, which is how do you therefore deal, in particular with developing economies, with the greatest adaptation needs as well as mitigation needs? Right now in the global negotiations there are 3, 4 or 5 different calculations and calculating methodologies being discussed between various governments as to how that might be arrived at. There is no consensus on that at this stage. One of the good things which occurred most recently in New York when the UN Secretary-General convened a dinner of the major parties, you know, the President of the United States and Germany, France and others. We were there as well from our own region, together with China, together with Japan and others, but also Kiribati. And Kiribati and their president, Mr. Anate Tong, who I've got to know very well from the Pacific Island Forum, gave an extraordinary presentation to all at the table about the sheer impact of all this on him, his people. Population of Kiribati, from memory, 50, 60, 70,000, low-lying coral atoll, together with Tuvalu, smaller population, formerly the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. For these countries, this is an existential threat. Those who follow the debate will be familiar with that. So there are deep questions which arise, frankly, at that very basic level as to how do you deal with the immediate unfolding impact of even modest inundation from the seas. On the question of proportional distribution across the world, again, that is the subject of rolling debate and an absence of consensus at this stage. Our view on this is, and it's a bit like our view to changes to the global economic institutions and recent changes to the International Monetary Fund, is Australia will always subscribe to its fair and proportional share. But we do not have a formula, an agreed formula across the world against which that would be based. But the case for adaptation assistance for the most vulnerable developing countries, given the existential threats to their populations, particularly in the low-lying small island states around the world, is huge. Therefore, we need at minimum to calculate that, and so that appropriate support can be given. Already Australia does so in part with one of the funds I referred to before to assist small island countries with adaptation and mitigation, primarily in our region, and that's under the aid program, $150 million now. We're doing a lot of work in Tuvalu, a lot of work in Kiribati. We've been rolling this out for the last couple of years. But globally, there are many small island states, and not just in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Caribbean as well.
Lady up the back.
Prime Minister, I'm Jennifer Chen from NTD Newton TV based in New York. I think one of the reasons for the opposition or climate change spectacles is if large countries like China and India do nothing, it is meaningless for Australia to do anything. So what are you going to say to the leaders of China and India in the Copenhagen meeting?
Can I say with both President Hu Jintao, with Premier Wen Jiabao, most recently we had Senior Vice Premier Li Keqiang in Australia. We've had extensive conversations on this subject, and my own response to the Chinese leaders and sense of where the Chinese leaders want to go is that China wishes to play a strong and positive role in getting an outcome at Copenhagen and beyond. The precise mathematics around that is yet to be determined, but I see an increased preparedness on the part of our friends in Beijing to be part of the substantive negotiating process. I leave for India in a few days' time, and a large part of my discussions with Prime Minister Singh in New Delhi next week will be on this subject as well. India also, I believe, is open to engagement on how they can form part of an appropriate global compact, the grand bargain that I talked about before. Here is the problem that we face. It's what I described before as the everyone else should go first except me argument, the prisoner's dilemma argument. And I've heard this repeated in so many forms and so many languages around the world that you could almost write a novelette about it. Is that the consequence of the impact of climate change sceptics, for example, in the United States, Australia and elsewhere, then reverberates into the global negotiations as well. If the climate change sceptics, the climate change deniers begin to undermine political will in the United States to act, if, for example, in Australia, the same happens here in terms of the passage of the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme through the Senate, where we don't control the numbers, and if that happens and unfolds in other countries, what happens then is the collective ambition across, let's call it the collective developed world, begins to corrode and erode. And I've said in my formal remarks, that frankly is the political ambition of many of the climate change sceptics that work around the world. But the roll-on consequences is that our friends in New Delhi and Beijing then look at this and say, well, if there is collapsing ambition there, what therefore can we justify to our own domestic constituencies, given the enormous development challenges that we face within China and within India, within China still with 300 million people below the poverty line, despite the enormous number of people who have been lifted out of poverty by China's economic reforms. So the reverberating effect, therefore, of what I describe as the insidious activity of climate change sceptics around the world is not just limited to a single country, it then reverberates and impacts what I describe as your ability to pull off the grand bargain between developed and developing countries. What are we doing about that? A lot. We're very active in the negotiations, trying to find creative ways through these impasses, but you always sense there is this activity on the ground through lobbyists around the world arguing the case of a whole range of vested interests, both directly and through the agency of certain political parties, chipping and chipping and chipping away at the underpinnings of the science and the political consensus which is necessary to craft a program of action.
Okay, one last question, the gentleman with the beard here.
Thank you, David Hill from the Murdoch University Asia Research Centre. Prime Minister, you mentioned the carbon partnership that Australia has with Indonesia and with Papua New Guinea. I wondered if you'd comment on how successful those partnerships have been, and more generally on what Australia's role has been in influencing the position of governments in particularly Southeast Asia on this issue.
Well, thank you for the question. A bit like Joe and I's response to the French Revolution, it's too early to tell in terms of its impact so far. We've only been doing it for a while, as you know, but we are, however, right now in the business of active auditing of our efforts so far in PNG, and I think we are a little slower in terms of the commencement date in Indonesia. So once we have audited, then we'll be making appropriate statements in cooperation with our partners in both Jakarta and Port Moresby. More broadly, in terms of, let's call it what's called in the parlance RED, which is how you deal with avoided deforestation around the world, and it's an entire area of needed collaboration affecting not just the major rainforest countries of Brazil, of Indonesia, of Papua New Guinea and of the Congo, but more broadly in terms of the treatment of, let's call it, forestation. I attended a session which was chaired by the UN Secretary-General in New York, explicitly on RED. If we manage to achieve a real outcome on avoided deforestation around the world, potentially this contributes to as much as 20%, or 18 to 20% of reducing total global greenhouse gas emissions. Part of the software of doing it lies in effective measurement. That is, if you contract with a bunch of, let's call it, rainforest farmers, local tribespeople in various parts of the countries that I've just referred to, and the deal is done in terms of what will be traded, if you like, in terms of either permits or other forms of financial transactions in exchange for rainforests being retained as opposed to sold off to loggers, you've got to measure that it's actually happening that way. Hence a great little Australian innovation using satellite-based technology, which we're deploying both in PNG and Indonesia with their full cooperation, which is down to quite micro-sized plots of land and ability to measure whether in fact the contracts have been entered into are being honoured on the ground. There's an active debate between ourselves and I think it's the FAO worldwide, the Food and Agricultural Organisation, about whether that, or shall we say ground-based measurement and surveillance is the best way to go. Pardon my scepticism, but I'd rather put my money behind the satellite-based measurement systems that we've developed. But that debate is ongoing as well. Part of the possible global utility of what we're doing with our partnerships in PNG and Indonesia is if it works, and if they all corroborate our conclusion that it has worked, that it's measurable, that it's real, and that forests are being preserved consistent with the payments that have been made, then the applicability of that, shall I say, surveillance system, that measurement system, to the other big rainforest countries, particularly Brazil and in Africa, is huge. That's why we're so active and strong in supporting this program in those two neighbouring countries.
Okay. Prime Minister, thank you for coming along today and sharing your thoughts with us on this important issue. The Lowy Institute values the close relationship we have with your government, and we hope that continues. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please join with me in thanking the Prime Minister?